these wonders, which are somehow a bit naive. Both the people who go there and the logic with which they're being built, they represent a sort of other, in a way, of classic modernity, at least in architectural terms. But it's another that is not the very sexy, elegant other of theories of otherness. It's the real other, the
Right.
other that you find out of the door.
So this might be something like the idea that, rather than the kind of extra European other, someone in an African city, right? In a contemporary African city, it's not something tribal or something primitive or something with pre-modern ideas and blah, 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 blah. No, they're entirely modern. They're wearing the same sports clothes that you are, except they might be cheaper than those things that you're wearing,
Sure.
and et cetera and so on. Yeah.
And also the other way around. These things, these architectural phenomena, they are not only existing in faraway exotic countries, they exist in Western countries as well, in America, in Western Europe. They are more or less evenly spread around the world.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm delighted to welcome today Pier Paolo Tamburelli, whom you may have heard before. Longtime listeners may recognize his voice when he says hello. Why don't you say hello? Hi, Pier Paolo.
Hello.
Hello.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you. He's a practicing architect based in Milan and a professor at the Technical University of Vienna. If you've heard him before, it's because you'll have heard him on Silvio Berlusconi, An Oral History, this podcast's homage to Berlusconi upon the great man's death. So Pier Paolo gave his take on Berlusconi back then.
One of the person I hated the most in my life, but mainly for football reasons. And now I have to admit he was the greatest president of a football club ever, probably. So
that and I'm sure that's hard to say for
it's very hard to say.
Yeah. We're not talking about football, although we are talking about wonders of the modern world. This is this fantastic edition of Arch Plus magazine, which people watch on video can see, and I have found it a delight to read. We're going to learn a little bit about what's in it and why we're discussing it. Though I guess I would take the opportunity just to ask you about the demolition and reconstruction of San Siro. Is that a wonder of the modern world? For those who don't follow football, it's the iconic stadium shared by both Inter and AC Milan.
Well, that would be a very long conversation, and I also think this story is not over. I've also been somehow writing, of course, opposing the demolition of what is probably the second most important monument in this city. Well, yeah, to a certain extent, is a wonder, but in reality, it doesn't belong into our classification for the research we've been doing in Vienna, because it has too clearly a function. So it's something that you can actually explain quite well. It's a football stadium. People go there in order to watch football games. And then all of the emotions that are associated to these buildings are somehow a consequence of that. But the wonders are, in a way, things that are far less easily classifiable. That's why they are called wonders. That's a deliberately imprecise category.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to ask you more specifically about this and to define it. So this is, I mean, having read this, and as I say, I found it hugely enjoyable to kind of imaginatively travel to these places, but also, especially, the kind of theoretical justification for it, with which I agreed a lot. So this is a kind of a catalog of places and sites, specifically of ritual and wonder, and about the architecture of them. But as I say, it's a lot bigger and deeper than that. Some of the themes, just to maybe foreshadow some of the stuff we're going to talk about in a more kind of maybe philosophical register, not just about architecture, is that if enlightenment means disenchantment, the disenchantment of the world, I guess this proposes the idea that maybe we need some form of re-enchantment. And I'm put in mind of the famous quote from Gramsci, and maybe to kind of slightly paraphrase him, so that the challenge of modernity is to live a life without illusions, but without becoming disillusioned. And I guess this proposes that maybe we need, if not a god back, or maybe not even a secular god, but at least some sort of collective rituals, maybe even to rebuild society. Anyway, these are all things we're going to come on to. But firstly, tell us about this project. Tell us about the impetus behind it, and also the places, because you've created a list, a long list of 50 places to visit and document over the course of the next 10 years. So I'd like to know kind of what structured this, what are the parameters, what was the impulse behind doing this?
Well, it's two separate things. Maybe it might help to start from the list. So maybe also the people who are listening get a bit of an idea of what this thing might be. So the places we visited so far, which are 9, are the Great Mosque of Touba in Senegal, which is the main mosque of the Murid community in Touba. The Batu Caves, which are Hindu Tamil temple into a former guano cave in Kuala Lumpur, which you access through a stair into the jungle with 272 steps, preceded by a 40-meter high golden statue of a deity that I believe is called Murugan. And the Mount Rushmore, so the 4 heads of American presidents sculpted into a mountain in South Dakota, the Wiesn, where the Oktoberfest is celebrated, so large popular celebration that repeats a first party made for marriage of a king of Bavaria. The Catholic sanctuary at Fatima, which is a small village in Portugal where there were apparitions of the Virgin Mary in the early 10s, and then a gigantic sanctuary has been built. The Sambudrome in Rio, which is a sort of stadium where there's a parade of carnival rafts and dancing people. The Tbilisi Chronicle of Georgia, which is a sort of Stone Age like, a squarish Stone Age like thing that looks out of Conan the Barbarian, and where there's a depiction of early Christian history of Georgia, which for some reason was done when Soviet Union was still existing. Actually, first they had a basement for a gigantic Stalin statue. Then they didn't want to do the Stalin anymore, and they did this. The Basilica, the Notre Dame de la Paix Basilica in Yamoussoukro in Ivory Coast, which is actually a clumsy copy of St. Peter, but full scale. And so these are a bit the things we visited. And we have a list of things like these. And in a way, just to start the conversation, I think it's a list of leftovers, of things that you never consider when you study architecture, of things that are difficult to classify or are too big, too kitschy, too inelegant. But are also modern, because all this thing has been built very recently. Then I think we can discuss more in detail the time classification. And the last thing is that at the very first level, you would think that this thing do not belong to our time. So a Hindu temple inside of a gigantic cave where you have the stalagmites, you call those things that
Stalactites, yeah.
stalactites, and which is in the jungle, and you go up 272 steps. This thing has been done in, I don't know, 500 before Christ, but actually no, this has been done in the 70s. Like the Mokattam churches, which are other churches that are once again this time artificially digged into the rock in Mokattam in Cairo for the Coptic community. And this thing has also been done in the 70s and 80s. And there are these bas reliefs, which are really ugly, but they have been made with the, I believe it's called the angle grinder. So this disc that you use to cut tiles on a construction site. So there's a Christian Coptic bas relief made with this type of technology in the 70s in a rock digged at the Mokattam Hills, which is actually the Coptic neighborhood. So the Copts are also the cleaners, the Zapayin of Cairo. So you have this gigantic neighborhood, which is also the only neighborhood in Cairo where you would find pigs. And on top of it, there are these wonders, and wonders just because you just wonder, you don't know what it is. So 4 years ago, I became professor in Vienna, and my academic position became a little bit more established. So started to have a staff and so forth. And I was coming from writing this book about Bramante that I was writing for more or less 15 years, which was very, how to say, solitary endeavor. And I thought, okay, now I have a staff. I need to do something that can be shared and that I can do with other people. And so I decided we could do this work. Then maybe the theoretical presupposition, I don't know how.
Well, why don't you go
Maybe
ahead?
you
Yeah,
have
why do you fill in this important element to it?
Well, the idea is that fundamentally, and here, of course, we are a bit simplifying, but particularly in architecture, modernism has been a great attempt at simplifying things. This is very clear if you check what I think we can take as the beginning of modern architecture, which is a book by a French abbot called Marc-Antoine Loger, which is titled Essay on Architecture. It's a book of 1751 and 53 in the second edition, which is the more important. And the book starts with the story of the so-called primitive hut. So the story starts like that. There's a primitive man. Primitive man is sleeping on the grass. He's happy, sunny. Everything is fine. And at a certain moment, it starts to rain. So the primitive men rush into a forest because in the forest it's not raining. So problem is solved. But after a while, it rains also in the forest. So he goes into a cave, and in the cave, it's not raining, but it's humid, it's dark, it's unpleasant. So he gets out, goes back to the forest, takes some fallen branches, and builds his own primitive hut. So the first building in the history of mankind, which, according to Loger, has to serve as a model for contemporary and future architecture. And this contemporary future architecture has to be much more logical, much more simple than what was produced in 1753 around Loger. And of course, this story is an unbelievable simplification, and it sounds like the story of origin of exchange in I don't know, Wealth of Nation or Robinson Crusoe or whatever. But I think in architecture, this thing is more clear. And it's more clear because the previous theory, like the theory that goes back to Vitruvius, to the classical time, was actually a bit less clear, but more reasonable, all in all. Just to make an example, in the story of Loger, the primitive man is alone. So he would have died because he could not reproduce. It's Adam without Eve. And the story is really sad. He never speaks, he never wants to do anything. He's not even, how to say, tempted by the devil. Like he's just fucking alone, and his only problem is rain, only meteorological problems.
Right.
Yes.
It's barely human, really. I mean, he's kind of hardly a social being, really.
Yeah, it's the most liberal thing you can, like classic liberal thing. And it's interesting that because normally architecture always comes after. Like architecture always absorbs innovation that happens in other discipline, because it's by definition slow. It takes a lot to build. Things, once they're built, they stay there forever. And it also then, I believe, secretly attracts people who have an interest in this sort of slowness, certainly myself. But in this case, the treaty by Loger is written some 20 years before Wealth of Nation, for instance. So architecture there is strangely avant-garde, which never happens, more or less. So if we look back and we look at what was the theory before, I don't know, Vitruvius, and if we check Vitruvius in beginning of the second book of Vitruvius, he says, well, people start to walk in erect position, and then they met around fire, started to clumsily talk, and then after that, they start to make buildings. And it's a completely different story, because language is part of this story, exchange is part of this story. And if you check, for instance, the interpretation in the Italian Renaissance, like there's a fantastic engraving by Cesare Cesariano in the edition of 1521. And you see all these people around, and there's these people with these stones in their in their hands, and they carry this stone on top of their heads, and they're also quite aggressive. So there's violence there. In the background, there's a lady with a naked tit. So there's sexuality. All these things are there from the beginning. And this also means, and this maybe is very disciplinary, but okay, that the first thing in architecture is the city. The city is the precondition for architecture. While on the contrary, Loger very clearly says, no, first architecture very clearly for a precise reason, and then the city is nothing but a sum of different architecture.
Okay.
So these simplification.
I was going to say, how do you position yourself then? What's the project? How does it relate to these two different understandings of architecture?
Well, I very much support the archaic reading of the thing because it's simply more realistic. And I think, for instance, in other fields, this critique of the origins has been done. Like the critique of the origin of economy in Adam Smith has been done by Marcel Mauss, Marshall Salins, blah, blah, blah. There's infinite in anthropology. In architecture, this thing has been done by a few architects. I think there's a lineage, Adolf Floos, Aldo Rossi, Rem Koolhaas. But in a way, these simplification still remains a little bit the basis of kind of shared understanding of things. So what is interesting for us is to look at the things that actually should disappear if we really accept this idea of architecture. And if we just look around, the contemporary world is full of things that do not follow this classification. And particularly the things that do not follow this classification, this implicit classification of modernism, are things that are very big and in a way totally in your face. One of the example that I made in the text is that in 1927 there are two things that are done at the same time, and one is the Siedlung in Stuttgart in Germany, coordinated by Mies van der Rohe with Le Corbusier, Martstam, blah blah blah. And in the United States, a really bad sculpture called Gatzenborgholm start a thing called Mount Rushmore Memorial, blah blah blah. And the thing is that if you read history of architecture, you will never ever hear about Mount Rushmore.
Mm-hmm.
And if you watch and consider popular culture, you will never ever hear about Siedlung, which is a little bit strange in my opinion. So we thought, okay, why don't we go and look at this thing? These things that have not even been looked at when there was the great postmodernist reset, when Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown went to Las Vegas. They wrote Learning from Las Vegas, but not even then went to Mount Rushmore. Because I think Mount Rushmore is not part of the architectural conversation for reasons that are different from the reason that kept Las Vegas out. And I also think my personal interest is not really into the picturesque, which was maybe the interest of, or the deliberately lowbrow kind of pop interest, typical of the late 60s and of that period. I think what we are interested in is something that, if we want to dismiss it's actually more kitsch than picturesque.
Right. I was going to ask, because I mean, the criteria that you set up primarily are three, right? That it's very big, that it pretends to be ancient, and that it's ugly. And you go, well, that's pretty tacky or kitsch. I mean, almost by definition. And yet it's about wonder and awe. So at some level, they have to tap into something. And usually we think that it's the very bigness is obviously important, but also the very ancient nature, even perhaps that it's lost to the mists of time, that inspires awe. And then here it's something that just pretends to do that, something built in the 70s or 80s. And it feels kind of postmodern in that regard, of just kind of a collation of various different styles pretending to be old, whatever. So, well, let me ask you a personal question about the experience of this. Have you felt wonder or maybe awe in any of your visits to these places? And if not, then why do you think other people do?
Some of them are actually strangely beautiful, like the Batu Caves in Kuala Lumpur are strangely beautiful. The Sambodrome is beautiful, but that's easier because that's been designed by Oscar Niemeyer, so it's a bit of an exception. The other thing is that some of these stories are so extreme that there is a specific quality in these places. Like in Yamoussoukro, there's this almost entirely abandoned copy of St. Peter, which was built, like the promoter of the project was Filio Pouet-Boigny, who was the first and for a very long period only president of Ivory Coast. And when he started to be 80, he wanted to build this gigantic church in what was his village that he transformed into the capital. And if you go today to Ivory Coast, it's not even clear if Yamoussoukro is no more the capital. In theory, it's still the capital, but everything happens in Abidjan. And in a way, building a copy of St. Peter at the fringe of the East Guinean forest is fantastic experience. It's pure Fitzcarraldo.
Yeah, yeah.
It's actually, yeah, it makes you wonder. And then you go there, and there's this immense church that's perfectly built. There are these concrete, prefabricated concrete Doric columns that are immense and perfect, like absolutely beautiful. And there's this gigantic portico open onto the forest where there's nobody, and it's so big and so strange. At the same time, it's a failure. And it's a failure because the architect who had this opportunity could not really make entirely sense of it. We happened to interview this person. It's called Pier Paolo. Is a Ivorian Lebanese architect who's now in his 80s. We met him in Paris. He was incredibly suspicious of us because he thought we had some kind of hidden agenda. He couldn't believe we were really interested into that. So he was so off-putting for quite some time. But slowly we started to talk, and then he was super generous. Then when we went to Ivory Coast, his company hosted us, and he really, at a certain moment, explained clearly what was his condition and his problem, and that was he had studied it in Europe with Jean Dubuisson, who was important modernist architect, and he was a very talented modernist architect. There are some buildings by him in Abidjan, a fantastic pink mirror glass skyscraper, really aggressive and radical and modern, amazing. And a cathedral, a modernist cathedral somewhere else. And at a certain moment, he gets in contact. He was already in contact with the president, and at a certain moment, he understands that the president wants to do this church, and he tries to convince him to do it like a contemporary, like Kenzo Tange or I don't know, Philip Johnson, and then he explained to us that he understood the president didn't want that. He continuously asked him, "Why don't you go to Rome?" And so he understood he had to copy St. Peter fundamentally. But he didn't want. So in the church, there are certain, I think without pictures, impossible to explain, but there are certain
I'll try to stick some pictures along here as we go through.
Which are very beautiful because in a way he desperately doesn't want to do a copy of St. Peter. And somehow in certain corners he even manages and it's interesting. But the thing in the end is that these very sophisticated and architect and extremely intelligent person anyhow was educated into a theory of architecture that doesn't prepare you for the possibility of building a copy of St. Peter in Ivory Coast.
Mm-hmm.
So he simply had no category, and he could not even enjoy the fun of an initiative like that, which, if you allow me to go back to a completely different thing, is not so far from what Bramante did when he did the real St. Peter, the one in Rome. Because the tradition is that St. Peter is made as a sum of the Pantheon and the Basilica of Maxentius, basically dropping the dome of the Pantheon on top of the Basilica of Maxentius. And it's actually an equally stupid idea. Stupid, but then re-elaborated and intellectualized with also extreme sense of humor and sophistication that then produces what is today St. Peter, at least the beginning, because then the Bramante option is...
So the idea here is that something, which obviously would be understood as a wonder, and it's, it takes your breath away when you first go to St. Peter's, just because, if anything, it's just so big. And it's that. I guess what you're saying is that itself was maybe in some ways kitsch as well,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
Right from the start.
but
So I mean,
it was disciplined.
right.
That's a bit the thing, that the drive to the kitsch, the very naive desire for architecture is still there in our society in different ways, of course. But architecture doesn't want to tame these instincts in a way, and just want to deal with a separate set of categories,
Okay.
which
So let's get down to it, really, because I mean, you make the claim, I think, that architecture has lost its ritual dimension, and all of these places, or most of these places, are places of ritual. I mean, I think even so, more or less, right? I mean, because
more or less, yeah,
what was the
they're
example
not
that you
all
gave, like of
religious building.
right? No, not and certainly not of religious, but there might be other rituals, right? I mean, the
Sure,
Samba de
sure,
Rumun
sure.
in Rio is
Mhm.
it's a ritual of carnival, and there's I mean, Mount Rushmore, I guess, doesn't really have a ritual associated with it. Although you could argue
There's
that doing the
there's
road
a
trip to it or
biker.
something, yeah,
There's a big biker, how you called it, meeting. I guess the correct word is another, but rally maybe,
yeah,
in a place called Sturgis, which is very, very close to it. And I went once to Mount Rushmore before this research, and I went by chance in the moment in which there was this Sturgis rally, and and it was unbelievable, the amount of bikers that were there, and it was just this car with these four idiotic Europeans who were going there for weird reason, and everybody else on the street was biker on a Harley Davidson and with leather jackets.
right. I mean, so okay, so there is in some way or another some form of ritual associated to these very big, pretend to be ancient, ugly places of these modern wonders. And I mean, I guess what you're pushing towards is in some ways against modernism, which has directed itself to maybe the scientifically minded rationalist individual who is kind of let loose along in the world, and actually kind of the lost individual, the desocialized individual. And this is, I guess, if I've read you correctly, it's an attempt to kind of re-socialize the individual through this architecture, or at least to ask questions about it by pointing at these modern wonders of the world. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, you're pushing a little bit farther away than I would do. I mean,
Okay.
what we are doing, we are researching about architecture. So we are, for now, our scope is not to produce a theory of wonders, but just to produce a catalog in a sort of 19th century. Well, it was not objective, but kind of abstract, detached way. So the
And a
drawings
hierarchy,
we
and quite
do.
quite not hierarchical, right? I mean, it's all not one thing comes
No, and
in
it's a
first place.
list.
Yeah.
Like this, what we do is a list. We have this list of 50 places, and this list is also not fixed. Like every now and then we review it. We heard about something in somewhere. So why don't we add these at the beginning? For just to make a stupid example, at the beginning we add plenty of colossal statues, and then at a certain moment we realize that there's so many colossal statues that have been built in this planet after 1950s that it wasn't worth even really adding them.
Mm.
If you want to build a colossal statue of yourself, there's a North Korean company who does the engineering and the sculpture together. And actually, it's one of the few ways in which North Korea can, how to say, get good currency. So it's one of the few North Korean company in the world that exports. and you can contact them, and they build you your 60-meter high statue, and
Brilliant.
it's
Well,
there.
I'll put the link in the show
It's a
notes for
business.
any listeners who are of means and megalomaniacally minded as well to do that.
So, for instance, the statue of the Renaissance of Africa that is in Dakar, that has been built 15 years ago, has been built by North Korean company.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So maybe as a way to also kind of draw out more of the kind of maybe philosophical presuppositions, though, applied to architecture, of course. I'm going to ask you to unpack something that you write in the essay which opens this edition here. You claim that, I quote here, if the quote unquote generic city represented the architectural problem of a neoliberal post-historical world, then wonders might represent the problem of a planet where places remain distinct and where conflicts and history seem to have returned. There's quite a lot in there. I mean, just to maybe clarify for listeners, the generic city here, it's something that we've touched on, in fact, in a recent episode with Richard Williams about the very homogenized cityscape that all kind of gentrified areas of kind of major metropolises have and are driven by real estate speculation and so on, and often very kind of cold surveilled areas and whatever. So I guess that would be the generic city. And so that's go ahead.
The generic city specifically is the title of a text by Rem Koolhaas of the very late 90s, which is basically about airports, and airports as model for the type of city you described. But I think that was a moment in which Koolhaas was, I think, trying to like the condition of the late 90s. I think he didn't, not even Rem Koolhaas managed to like it entirely, but that was his attempt. And saying that the generic city is the future and the airport city is the model of the city of the future. It's partially true. It's also true that there are things that are site specific. All these things we discovered are very much rooted into a history which is political. The mosque in Touba was, for the Murid community, was paid mainly with French money of the French colonial state who was leaving Senegal at the time. And it was also the construction company, the administration, the architect, they were all French. And that was a way to negotiate a smooth leave from the French authorities, and was a compromise also with Senghor, who was the leader of the early post-colonial phase. And Senghor had a speech at the inauguration of this thing. The same thing with the Sambodromo, which was built at the end of the dictatorship. Actually, in a period, you probably know this story better than me, but I think Brazil had free state election, like state
municipal and state elections,
states, before general federal elections. And so there was a new governor of Sao Paulo, had a new secretary of culture, was an anthropologist, I believe, and he promoted Niemeyer. And Niemeyer came back because he was in exile in Paris and came back, and that was the first building he designed in Rio. So all these stories are specific. And maybe also to come back to your question before, maybe our ambition, which is probably more limited than what you asked before, but is to say that the world has never really been modern. On these, I don't agree much with Bruno Latour, but on that, I think he was right. The things were more complex, and this thing existed even in the 60s, in the 70s, and the brutal simplification of not looking at them, I think is not helping us.
In what way? In what way do you think they're not helping us?
No, what I think is that these wonders, which are somehow a bit naive, both the people who go there and the logic with which they're being built, they represent a sort of other, in a way, of classic modernity, at least in architectural terms. But it's another that is not the very sexy, elegant other of theories of otherness that you. It's the real other, the
Right.
other that you find out of the door. I think in the text I use the maybe stupid expression, actually existing other, like a little bit like in actually existing socialism. I mean, it's not so cool, but it's sort of socialism.
But yeah, so this might be something like the idea that, rather than the kind of extra European other, is, or someone, in an African city, right? In a contemporary African city, it's not something tribal or something primitive or something with pre-modern ideas and blah, 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 blah. No, they're entirely modern. They're wearing the same sports clothes that you are, except they miit be cheaper than those things that you're wearing.
Sure.
And et cetera and so on. Yeah.
And also the other way around, these things, these architectural phenomena, they are not only existing in faraway exotic countries. They exist in Western countries as well, in America, in Western Europe. They are more or less evenly spread around the world. But they're somehow dismissed too. I mean, I would not stand by this qualification 100%, but to a certain extent, these wonders are architecture for what was the term? Deplorables.
Right.
Yeah. So we don't really want to see these people who go to Batu Caves or to Lourdes or to the Oktoberfest or to Mount Rushmore.
Because it's seen as tacky architecture for tacky people. It's a bit Disneyfied, maybe. It's the way that people would
Yeah. And it's sometimes truly not elegant, but these things are there. The very first point of our research is to make a list of things that are undeniably there. Of these, there's also a model which is a book by an Austrian architect of the Baroque era, but this might be a little bit too nerdy. But the first point is this thing exists, and there's also contemporary architecture is always very pessimistic in thinking, oh, nobody needs architecture, nobody really wants to make monuments, and together with this, there's always the idiotic conservative intellectual who ask, oh, where are the cathedrals of today? And they're there. Just fucking look at them. And then we can discuss that it's interesting, it's uninteresting. It's also that in architecture, you can learn a lot also from things that in themselves are not necessarily beautiful. It's possible to, like Robert Venturi in Denise Scott Brown is an example of absorbing from sources that are not always so elegant to produce an incredibly sophisticated culture product.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.